Hey everyone, in this PowerPoint, I want to briefly explore the connections between the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal that brings down Richard Nixon, leading to his resignation in August 1974, the first sitting president to do so. So let's get started. 1972, Richard Nixon is running for re-election. His opponent, Democratic Senator George McGovern. By any measurement, Nixon had had an extremely successful first term as president. He had a number of important domestic policy initiatives, a number of pieces of important legislation dealing with the environment, creation of Amtrak, revenue sharing, an important legacy of the Nixon administration, and in foreign policy, as we've seen, Nixon began the period of withdrawing from the Vietnam War, scaling down direct American military involvement, reducing the number of troops in Vietnam each year. Other important foreign policy initiatives included implementing détente, improving relations with the Soviet Union. Nixon's spectacular visit to China started the process of developing official diplomatic relationship with China. And so pundits, pollsters, media commentary, most of the American public, pretty much everybody expected Nixon to win pretty handily in the 1972 election. What the public didn't realize is that from early on, the Nixon administration had started implementing at first what were questionable tactics and what quickly became illegal actions directed against critics of Nixon's Vietnam War policy, primarily members of Congress, the Senate, and journalists that the Nixon administration targeted. And these methods are then going to be shifted to being used as well against Nixon's political opponents, and this leads directly to the Watergate scandal. So this is the first part of this connection, that some of these things I'm mentioning in connection with Watergate, the Nixon administration and Nixon approved these, had already been using these methods against critics of his Vietnam War policy. So I'm not going to go into great detail about the Watergate scandal. To get that, you'll have to enroll in my 20th Century American History course. It's really beyond our purposes here. But you should know that in the summer of 1972, this complex you see in this photograph, the Watergate Complex, which at the time it opened was a mixed residential, commercial, high-end development in Washington, D.C., and it's still there and looks very similar to this today, very close to the Kennedy Center. And there was a security guard making rounds one night who came to a door that was supposed to be locked, that he discovered the lock had been taped over, and this was a suite of offices used by the Democratic Party's National Committee. So not knowing who's there, he calls for backup from the Washington, D.C. police, and a group of officers go into this suite of offices. What they find there are a group of 5 men, 4 of whom were Cuban Americans, and the 5th an American, James McCord, a former CIA agent who is now working for the Nixon campaign. This group was known as the Plumbers within the Nixon administration. What they were doing were actually checking listening devices that they had placed earlier on several phones in the offices of the Democratic National Committee. This was not their first break into the Watergate complex. They had planted listening devices on a previous break-in, and one of those was malfunctioning, and they were trying to figure out which one when they were caught. But they were a group that had been engaged in different illegal actions on behalf of the Nixon administration and the Nixon campaign prior to being caught at the Watergate. So another connection with this to the Vietnam War is that this same group had broken into the offices of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. And this happened after the release of the Pentagon Papers while Ellsberg's trial was going on. And they were looking for his personal medical file, trying to get information that could then be given to newspapers supportive of the Nixon administration so they could publish information that Nixon hoped would be damaging to Ellsberg, make him look as if he was mentally unstable, would discredit him completely. When all of this came to light, which it did as part of the Watergate investigations, the charges Ellsberg was facing for releasing the Pentagon Papers were dropped. So, as I said, I'm not going to go into detail about the various aspects of the Watergate investigation, but it's ongoing through 1973 into 74. Lots of damaging testimony against Richard Nixon as the result of work by a Senate investigatory committee. Nixon insisted all these people were lying, and it came down to the discovery by the investigatory committee that Nixon had this automated recording system in the Oval Office. Several previous presidents had recorded phone conversations at different times, really going all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. In this class, we've listened to examples earlier in the semester of recorded conversations by both John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Nixon took that further with an automated recording system that activated and recorded every conversation that happened in the Oval Office, and Nixon had intended this to be a historical resource for his presidential library. But once the committee learns the existence of this system, they can then request specific tapes to check out witness testimony. Particularly Nixon's lawyer, John Dean, had said, well, I had a conversation on June 20th with the president about the Watergate scandal at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is what he said. So these tapes were, to use the cliche, the smoking gun, that once the requested tapes were listened to, they clearly showed that while Nixon didn't know anything about the original Watergate break-in, once he learned about it, he approved steps that became known as cover-up to conceal any connection between his administration, his campaign, and the Watergate burglars. And so once this information comes out, as I note on this slide, it was clear that Nixon would be facing impeachment, that he would be impeached, but also certainly convicted in the subsequent trial by the Senate. So remember, as we've just seen with President Trump, impeachment means Congress, the House of Representatives, bringing charges against a president, and those are approved. It goes to a trial in the Senate. And in the case of recent presidents who have been impeached, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, both were impeached. Neither was convicted. In Nixon's case, he knew that he would be because there was virtually no support remaining for him, even from his own party, by 1974. So Nixon makes the decision to resign in August of 1974, first sitting president to do so. This is one of the oddest photographs of Nixon. Here he is leaving the White House, stepping on the Marine helicopter that's going to take him to Air Force One to fly him back home to California, leaving in complete disgrace. And as he's preparing to enter the helicopter, he turns and strikes his victory pose that he had used on the campaign trail. What he was thinking, I have no idea, but it became arguably the most famous picture of Nixon. It would be a toss-up between this and the photograph of him posing with Elvis Presley when Elvis visited the White House in 1970. So, some of the consequences of the Watergate scandal. Well, Nixon's actions, as I mentioned here, included lying, obstruction of justice by interfering with the Watergate investigation, and abuse of power. It came out that Nixon had used several federal entities, most notably the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, and even the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to harass critics. And this was a complete violation of the charter of the CIA. So again, as I said at the beginning of this PowerPoint, these things were directed against critics of Nixon's Vietnam War policies and then are transferred to his political opponents. So this is how the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal that brings down Nixon are entwined. So really you can make an argument that the Vietnam War contributes directly to Nixon's political destruction downfall. Came out that Nixon had maintained an enemies list, as he termed it, people that he said in one recording, these are the people we want to screw over. Politicians were on it, a couple historians, actor Paul Newman, who had been a critic of Richard Nixon. Curiously, New York Jets quarterback Joe Namath was also on the enemies list for reasons that have never been explained, other than we know Nixon was a New York Giants fan. But it was another aspect of the fallout from Watergate. Nixon's actions at the Watergate scandal, and I mentioned this in one of the slides about film in the 70s, contributed to further erosion of public trust in the presidency and government in general. I really believe as a historian that we are still living in the aftermath of this 1-2 punch of Vietnam and the subsequent Watergate scandal, the revelations about the lying, institutionalized lying, as well as individual lying. I mean, individual lying by presidents, institutional lying by the military and other entities about all sorts of aspects of the Vietnam War, as we've explored in this class. Tremendously damaging. And I think a lot of the distrust, skepticism, and for many Americans, outright cynicism about government can be traced back to these two events, Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. Probably harder for you guys to understand that in the era when these things happened, most Americans still believed that their elected officials were fundamentally honest with them. And Vietnam War, Watergate scandal really, really compromised that perception. So as I note on this slide, particularly among conservatives, this contributed directly to the rise of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, who famously said, government's not the solution, government's the problem. This embrace of limited government that the Republican Party has moved towards since the resignation of Nixon, the direct outgrowth of the Watergate scandal. And the same outlook, anti-government outlook, contributed to the rise of the Tea Party movement within the Republican Party during the presidency of Barack Obama. So these are far-ranging consequences stemming from this connection between the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and Nixon's downfall.